Ruth breathed heavily. Heat from the cast iron pot clung to her sweating face. Through the grease-stained cookhouse window, she watched the foreman, Hiram. He stood under the hurricane lamp, staring down at Gideon. The miner was doubled over, coughing dark blood onto the freezing mud. The town doctor called it stomach rot. Hiram called it a tragedy. But when Ruth collected Gideon's unfinished rations, she saw the white grit settled at the bottom of the tin bowl. She rubbed her thick, calloused thumb against it. It didn't dissolve. It cut. It sliced through her hardened skin. This wasn't a disease tearing the man apart. It was a calculated murder. What the foreman didn't realize was that a woman mocked for her heavy weight sees everything the world tries to hide. The terrifying truth she will soon uncover will leave the logging camp frozen in shock, and the real monster begging for mercy. Before we continue, tell us in the comments which country you're watching from and what time it is there. The flour had finally settled in the bakery, but the debt remained. Thomas was dead. He left behind a ledger bleeding red ink, and a widow the town of Oakhaven already wanted to forget. Ruth stood in the center of the cold kitchen. Her hands were still coated in white dust. She was a large woman, heavy-set, broad-shouldered. For years her size had been a tool. It gave her the strength to knead 50 pounds of dough before dawn. It allowed her to haul grain sacks that made grown men sweat. But in grief, her weight was just another thing for the town to despise. The front bell chimed. It was not a customer, it was Clara, Ruth's own sister. Clara was thin, her corsets were tight, her reputation in the church was spotless. Behind her stood Sheriff Miller. He was picking his teeth with a splinter of pine. His silver badge caught the morning light. Clara did not offer comfort. She offered a legal paper. "The bank took the deed, Ruth," Clara said. Her voice was like a wire snapping. "But I bought it out. To save the family name from your ruin. You have to leave." Ruth looked at the paper. Then she looked at her sister. "Where am I supposed to go?" Clara's eyes raked over Ruth's heavy frame. The disgust was not hidden. It was weaponized. "I secured you a position. Ironwood Logging Camp. They need a cook. A woman of your proportions is built for raw labor, not polite society. You are an eyesore here, Ruth. Thomas is dead. You have no money. You have no grace. Pack your things." Ruth did not scream. Screaming wasted air? She looked at Sheriff Miller. He adjusted his heavy gun belt. "Town ordinance says vagrants get locked up, Ruth. Your sister is doing you a massive favor. The lumber wagon leaves in an hour. Be on it." He spat the pine splinter onto her clean floorboards. A heavy woman with no money had no voice. She was a beast of burden, nothing more. Ruth turned away. She walked to the small back room. She took a canvas satchel. She packed one woolen dress, 2 pairs of thick stockings, a tin comb. She ignored the delicate china plates her husband had bought her. They were fragile. Fragile things did not survive in the wild. She walked back into the kitchen. She bypassed the silver cutlery. Instead, she reached for the large cast-iron skillet on the stove. It was black with years of seasoning. It weighed over 10 pounds. She strapped it to the outside of her satchel. It was the only thing she owned that could not be broken. Clara placed a single silver dollar on the counter. "For the road, do not write to me." Ruth took the coin. It was cold. She walked out the back door. The walk to the edge of town was an execution march. The autumn wind was already sharp. It bit through her thin wool shawl. The townspeople stood on the wooden boardwalks. They watched her. The baker's fat widow, finally driven out. They whispered behind gloved hands. Ruth kept her eyes forward. She carried her weight with slow, deliberate steps. Her calves burned. The heavy satchel dug into her thick shoulder. She focused entirely on the physical strain. If she focused on the ache in her muscles, she did not have to focus on the void opening in her chest. The lumber wagon was waiting near the livery. It was a massive, brutal thing, built for hauling dead pine, not soft flesh. The driver did not offer a hand to help her up. He merely tipped his hat chewed his tobacco, and pointed to the flatbed in the back. Ruth hoisted herself up. The wood groaned under her weight. She found a corner near a stack of rough-hewn planks. She sat down. The wood was splintered and covered in sticky sap. She pulled her knees up, trying to make her large frame as compact as possible. The driver cracked the whip. The heavy draft horses lunged forward. The wagon jolted, throwing Ruth's shoulder against the hard pine. She did not cry. Crying did not warm a freezing wagon. Tears froze on the skin and cracked. She kept her thick hands folded securely in her lap. The town of Oakhaven disappeared behind the tree line. The road turned to dirt, then to mud, then to frost-hardened ruts. The journey would take 3 days. 3 days of brutal wind winding up the treacherous mountain pass. The temperature dropped drastically as they climbed higher. By nightfall, the air felt like crushed glass in her lungs. The driver stopped only to water the horses. He slept up front, wrapped in a heavy bearskin coat. Ruth had no coat. She had her shawl, her thick skin, and a heel of stale bread she had taken from the bakery. She chewed the bread slowly in the dark. It was hard as stone. She let her saliva break it down. It tasted of nothing. It tasted of survival. The wind howled through the skeletal trees. It whipped her face, leaving her cheeks raw and violently red. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. Sleep was dangerous in the bitter cold. Instead, she counted the jolts of the wagon's iron wheels. 1, 2, 3. She memorized the pain in her lower back. She weaponized it. She turned the physical suffering into a shield against the mental collapse. She was exiled, sold for $1, but she was not dead. The second night bled into the third morning. The wagon climbed higher into the jagged spine of the mountain range. The pine trees thickened, their heavy branches blocking out the pale sun. Ruth's extremities were losing sensation. Her toes inside her thin leather boots felt like river stones. She curled and uncurled them rhythmically, forcing the sluggish blood to circulate. Pain meant the tissue was still alive. Numbness was the enemy. By the third afternoon, the air changed. It no longer smelled of pine needles and snow. It smelled of wet earth, iron, sweat, and cut resin. The driver didn't speak to her. He didn't warn her. She was cargo. Nothing more than a sack of grain to be delivered to the mill. Ironwood Logging Camp did not emerge gently from the trees. It tore through them. It was a massive, violent scar carved directly into the side of the mountain. Ruth saw it through the freezing mist before the wagon even rolled to a halt. There were no white picket fences here, no painted shutters, no curtains hanging in the windows. It was a landscape entirely stripped of mercy. Huge skeletal timber derricks loomed like gallows against the bruising purple sky. Black smoke choked the air, billowing from the rusted smokestacks of the steam-powered donkey engines. The noise was a physical weight pressing against her eardrums. The grinding, metallic scream of cross-cut saws. The rhythmic, bone-rattling thud of heavy axes biting into old-growth wood. The shouting of hoarse, angry men. The wagon lurched to a violent stop in the center of the camp. The ground here was not dirt. It was a thick, freezing slurry of churned mud, horse manure, and sharp sawdust. The driver unhitched the tailgate and walked away. He didn't look back. Ruth had to get down herself. Her joints were practically locked from 3 days of motionless freezing. She grabbed the edge of the rough pine board. Her thick fingers were stiff, the knuckles stark white. She forced her body to obey. She swung her heavy legs over the side. When her boots hit the ground, the freezing mud immediately sucked at her ankles, sinking halfway up her thick calves. The hem of her only woolen dress soaked up the filth instantly, the cold water wicking up the fabric. She didn't try to lift it. She didn't try to brush it off. Let it ruin. Vanity had no place in a graveyard. Men began to notice her. 50 hardened loggers. Men missing fingers, with faces scarred by flying splinters and bitter frost. They stopped swinging their axes. They leaned heavily on their peavy hooks and stared. There was no whistling. There was no catcalling. only cold, hard, calculating stares evaluating her bulk. They looked at her heavy waist, her broad shoulders, her flushed, wind-chapped face. They saw a draft horse, a creature brought in to pull a plow, chop the wood, and scrub the iron. Ruth felt their eyes. She absorbed the quiet humiliation, letting it sink into her thick skin like water into dry earth. She did not shrink. She did not try to hide her size. She stood her ground in the ankle-deep slush. She was a large woman. She would take up space. "You the new cook?" A voice barked over the whine of a saw. A young logger, missing half his front teeth, spat brown tobacco juice into the slush near her boot. "Cookhouse is over there." He pointed a filthy, calloused finger. Ruth looked. It was a long, sagging structure made of unpeeled logs. The tin roof was rusted red and buckling under the weight of old snow. The chimney belched thick, greasy smoke. It looked like a rotting carcass left in the woods. There was no flower box, no welcoming porch. Just a heavy wooden door smeared with black, oily handprints. It was the absolute void. Ruth adjusted the leather strap of her canvas satchel. The cast-iron skillet thumped heavily against her hip. A comforting, solid weight. She began to walk. The mud fought her with every step, sucking at her soles, but her legs were strong. She had carried the crushing weight of a dying bakery. She could carry herself through a few yards of slush. She walked right past the staring men. She didn't look at their faces. She looked at their boots. She was entirely alone. Her husband was in the ground. Her sister had sold her. The town had erased her. She was a ghost trapped in a heavy, breathing body. She reached the door of the cookhouse. She did not knock. She placed her large, flat hand against the wood and pushed. The heavy iron latch shrieked in protest. She stepped inside. The heat hit her like a physical blow, thick with the nauseating smell of rancid bacon grease, boiled cabbage, and unwashed wool. The floorboards were slick with years of spilt animal fat. She let the heavy door slam shut behind her. It cut off the stares of the men. It cut off the piercing wind. She was in the exile now. There was nowhere left to fall. The void had swallowed her whole. She set her satchel down in the grease. She was ready to work. The heavy wooden door of the cookhouse swung open behind her, hitting the log wall with a violent crack. The freezing draft rushed in, briefly cutting through the thick smell of old grease. Ruth turned slowly. The man standing in the doorway was Hiram, the camp foreman. He was a man carved from cheap timber and bad intentions. He wore a heavy canvas coat lined with soiled sheepskin. His face was weathered like old leather, his eyes pale and sharp as rusted nails. He smelled of cheap rye whiskey, chewing tobacco, and unchecked authority. He didn't step fully into the room. He stood on the threshold, bringing the cold with him, and looked Ruth up and down. He took his time. It was the same look a butcher gives a slab of meat on the cutting block, assessing the fat-to-muscle ratio. "The letter from the bank said they were sending a widow," Hiram said. His voice was a low, grating rasp. It sounded like a shovel dragging across gravel. "They didn't say they were sending a draft horse." Ruth stood perfectly still. Her broad hands rested against her thighs. She did not lower her chin. She did not cross her arms to hide her heavy stomach. She let the insult hang in the greasy air. Let him see her mass. Let him underestimate the mind behind it. When she didn't react, Hiram spat a stream of dark brown tobacco juice onto the floorboards, mere inches from her muddy boots. "You're the cook now," he commanded. "I don't care about whatever life you had in town. Out here, you are machinery. The rules are simple. You wake up at 3 in the morning. You have breakfast ready for 50 men by 4. Salt pork, beans, flapjacks, and coffee thick enough to float a horseshoe. You have supper ready when the whistle blows at sundown. You keep the sty clean." He took one step into the kitchen. His pale eyes narrowed. "You do not speak to my men. You do not complain about the cold. You do not ask for extra wood for your stove. And you stay away from cabin 4. Ruth's expression remained entirely flat. "Who is in cabin 4? Her voice was calm, deep. It lacked the nervous tremor Hiram was clearly accustomed to hearing from the camp's previous laborers. That irritated him. "A dead man," Hiram snapped. "Gideon, he was a miner. Staked a claim up the ridge before the company bought this land. Now he's rotting from the inside out. Doctor from the valley came up last month. Called it stomach rot. Said his insides are turning to black mush. He's highly contagious. He's just taking his sweet time dying." Hiram pointed a thick, gloved finger at her face. "You boil a thin gruel for him twice a day. You walk it to the edge of the tree line. There is a sawed-off pine stump outside his door. You leave the tin bowl on the stump. You do not knock. You do not open that door. You do not breathe his air. You drop the food and you walk away. If you catch his rot and bring it into my camp, I won't bother sending you back to town. I'll bury you in the mud myself. Do we understand each other? Leave the bowl on the stump. Stay out of cabin 4. Ruth repeated the instructions. No emotion. Pure repetition of fact. Hiram sneered, showing teeth stained brown at the roots. "Get to work, widow." He turned and walked out, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The iron latch clicked into place. Ruth was alone again. She stood in the center of the kitchen and exhaled slowly. The air was suffocating. She looked around. The cookhouse was a disaster. The previous cook had clearly given up months ago. Mounds of hardened animal fat congealed on the massive black iron stovetop. The wooden prep tables were coated in a sticky layer of spilled molasses and flour dust. Unwashed tin plates were piled high in a rusted zinc basin. For a normal woman, the sheer volume of filth would have broken her spirit. For Ruth, it was salvation. She took off her wool shawl and hung it on a rusted nail near the door. She reached into her canvas satchel and pulled out her heavy, seasoned cast-iron skillet. She set it carefully on a clean corner of the counter. It was her anchor. Then, she found a stiff canvas apron hanging over a chair. It was stained with old blood and soot. She tied it tightly around her wide waist. She rolled up the sleeves of her dress, exposing her thick, powerful forearms. She went to the woodpile stacked haphazardly in the corner. She grabbed a heavy iron poker and stoked the dying embers in the belly of the massive stove. She fed it dry pine kindling, then heavier oak logs. She worked the bellows until the fire roared, filling the iron belly with a fierce, radiating heat. Next, she found the lye soap. It was a harsh, caustic block of yellow fat and ash. She filled the massive zinc basin with water from the indoor hand pump and set it directly over the hottest part of the stove. She waited until the water reached a rolling, violent boil. Then she plunged a stiff, bristled scrub brush into the scalding water, rubbed it raw against the lye soap, and hit the stovetop. The physical labor was immediate and brutal. The hot lye burned the skin of her knuckles. The friction of the brush against the hardened grease sent sharp spikes of pain shooting up her wrists, into her forearms, and deep into her broad shoulders. She welcomed the pain. She leaned her heavy frame into the brush, using her entire body weight to scrape away the filth. Scrub, push, grind, breathe. The heat in the kitchen rose drastically. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes, soaking the collar of her wool dress. She didn't stop to wipe it. The burning in her muscles grew louder, drowning out the memory of her sister's voice. The intense, rhythmic physical exertion became a wall of white noise, blocking out the void. She scrubbed until her hands bled. It was exactly what she needed. The days blurred into a single, agonizing loop of physical exertion. 3 a.m. The air in the cookhouse was cold enough to see her breath. Ruth woke on a thin, lumpy cot shoved near the potato sacks in the pantry. Her joints screamed from the cold and the previous day's labor. She ignored them. Pain was just information. It meant she was awake. She stoked the massive iron stove. It devoured wood. She hauled 50-pound sacks of flour from the main barrel without asking for help. She kneaded dense dough until her thick shoulders burned with lactic acid. She sliced heavy slabs of salt-cured pork. She boiled coffee in a massive zinc pot until it was black, bitter, and thick as river mud. At 4 in the morning, the iron triangle rang out. 50 loggers piled into the mess hall attached to the kitchen. They brought the overpowering stench of wet wool, dried sweat, and pine sap. They ate like starving dogs. Forks scraped violently against tin plates. No one said thank you. No one looked at her face. They looked only at her heavy, capable arms ladling the beans and dropping the hot flapjacks. To them, she was not a woman. She was just the mechanism that kept the food coming. Hiram sat at the head of the long table. He watched her work. He was waiting for her to break. He was waiting for the heavy, displaced widow to drop a cast iron pan, to complain about the heat, or to weep from the crushing exhaustion. She did neither. She served. She cleaned. She scrubbed the long wooden tables with lye and scalding water. She remained an absolute machine. By mid-morning, the camp was empty again. The loggers vanished into the tree line. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic thud of axes miles up the mountain. It was time for cabin 4. Hiram had been explicitly clear about the routine. He walked into the kitchen just as Ruth was finishing the morning dishes. He carried a small, unmarked canvas sack. He set it on the prep table, deliberately keeping it far away from the main camp flour barrels. "For the dead man," Hiram said, "special medicinal flour from the doctor down in the valley. You use only this for his gruel. You add water, a pinch of salt. Nothing else. His stomach can't handle anything rich. You boil it thin." Ruth looked at the small sack. She nodded once. Hiram left the kitchen. Ruth opened the sack. The flour inside was stark white, almost unnaturally fine. She didn't question it yet. Survival meant following the rules of the camp. She scooped a small amount into a separate tin pot. She added water from the pump. She stirred it over the heat until it became a thin, gray paste. It looked like wallpaper glue. It smelled of absolutely nothing. She poured the paste into a dented tin bowl. She put on her wool shawl. She stepped out the back door into the biting wind. Cabin 4 sat entirely separated from the rest of the camp. It was pushed right up against the dense, forbidding tree line. The pines hung over its sagging roof like dark, heavy claws. There was no smoke coming from its stone chimney. It looked abandoned. A tomb built above ground. Ruth walked through the frozen mud. The wind whipped her heavy skirt around her thick calves, chilling her to the bone. She held the tin bowl carefully, keeping her bare thumbs clear of the hot metal. She saw the sawed-off pine stump Hiram had mentioned. It sat exactly 3 feet from the heavy wooden door of cabin 4. The door was heavily scarred. The iron hinges were rusted solid. She reached the stump. She set the tin bowl down. She was supposed to walk away. That was the rule. Drop the food. Walk away. Do not breathe his air. But as she turned, a sound came from inside the cabin. It was a cough. But it was not a normal human cough. It sounded wet, tearing. It sounded like a man trying to breathe through a throat full of broken glass. The coughing fit went on for a full minute, muffled by the heavy logs. It ended in a ragged, desperate gasp, followed by the heavy thud of a body collapsing back onto a wooden frame. Ruth stood frozen in the bitter wind. She stared at the thick wooden door. There was a man in there. A man dying alone in the freezing dark, fed on gray paste while 50 men up the mountain chopped wood and entirely ignored his existence. He was discarded, just like her. She did not reach for the door handle. The rules were the rules. Breaking them meant being thrown out into the snow without a coat. She could not save anyone if she froze to death first. She turned her back on cabin 4. She walked back to the cookhouse. This became her rhythm, the sanctuary of chores. Chop the wood, boil the water, knead the dough, feed the men, scrub the lye, boil the medicinal flour, walk to the stump, hear the horrific tearing cough, walk back. At night, the camp went dead. The loggers slept in the bunkhouse, their snores echoing like distant thunder. Ruth slept alone in the freezing cookhouse. She had one thin woolen blanket. She would heat a flat river stone in the stove's embers, wrap it in a heavy rag, and place it at the foot of her cot to keep her toes from getting frostbite. She lay on her back in the dark. She didn't think about her dead husband. She didn't think about her sister's cruelty. She thought about the weight of the flour sacks. She thought about the rust on the hinges. She kept her mind locked on the tangible, the physical. If she let her mind drift to the abstract, to hope, to unfairness, to loneliness, she would shatter. She was surviving. But the man in cabin 4 was not. November hit the mountain like a swinging anvil. The mud of Ironwood Camp froze into jagged, iron-hard ruts. The temperature plummeted so fiercely that the moisture inside the cookhouse froze overnight. Ruth woke each morning to find a thick layer of white frost coating the inside of the log walls. The water in the massive indoor barrel would freeze 2 inches thick by dawn. Ruth did not complain. She used the heavy iron poker to smash the ice. She hauled the frozen chunks into her boiling pots. Her hands cracked. The skin around her knuckles split, weeping thin lines of blood that dried black in the cold air. She rubbed raw sheep's tallow into the wounds and kept working. Her heavy frame, once the source of her town's mockery, was the only thing keeping her alive. A thin woman would have frozen to death or broken under the sheer physical mass of the daily labor. Ruth was an engine. She fueled herself with leftover salt pork and bitter coffee. She moved with a slow, deliberate momentum that could not be stopped. The 50 loggers noticed. They stopped staring at her waistline. They stopped whispering. When a woman hauls 90 pounds of flour on her shoulder without breaking a sweat, the mockery dies. They began to clear her path when she walked through the mess hall. They did not respect her as a woman. They respected her as a force of nature. Hiram hated it. He wanted her shattered. He wanted her weeping in the corner, begging for a ticket back to the valley. He stood in the kitchen doorway one afternoon, watching her scrub the massive zinc plates. "You're using too much firewood," Hiram rasped, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "The men have to chop that. You don't burn company time to keep your fat warm." Ruth did not stop scrubbing. "The water must boil. Lye does not cut grease in cold water. If the plates are dirty, the men get sick. If the men get sick, the timber does not fall." She spoke in absolute mechanical facts. She did not look up. Hiram's jaw tightened. He took a step forward, his hand drifting toward the heavy leather belt at his waist. "You talk back to me again, widow, and I'll drag you out by your hair." Ruth stopped. She slowly placed the scrub brush down. She picked up a heavy, steel-forged meat cleaver. She didn't raise it. She didn't brandish it. She simply held it by her side and turned her broad shoulders to face him. Her face was entirely blank, a stone wall. "The water must boil," she repeated, her voice dead flat. Hiram looked at the cleaver. He looked at her thick, muscular forearms. He spat on the floor and walked out. He could not break her, so he focused his cruelty elsewhere. He focused on cabin 4. The man inside was running out of time. Ruth heard it. Every morning and every evening, when she carried the thin gray paste to the pine stump, the sounds from inside the cabin were worse. The coughing was no longer loud. It was weak. Wet. A terrible, suffocating rattle. Sometimes when she returned to collect the tin bowl, it was only half empty. Gideon was losing the strength to even lift the spoon. One afternoon, the camp doctor arrived on the supply wagon. He was a small, nervous man in a dirty wool suit. He smelled heavily of cheap gin. He did not go to cabin 4. He went straight to Hiram's office in the main bunkhouse. Ruth was carrying a load of split logs past the window. She stopped. She stood perfectly still in the snow, the heavy wood pressed against her chest, and listened through the thin glass. "He's taking too long," Hiram's voice growled. "I gave you the strongest mixture I had," the doctor stammered, clinking a glass against a bottle. "It tears the stomach lining. It's a slow bleed. It mimics the rot perfectly. No coroner down in the valley will question it. But you have to be patient. If you just shoot him, the federal marshal will ask questions. A man dying of natural stomach rot? The claim reverts to the camp. You get his gold map. Clean and legal. He didn't finish his bowl yesterday, Hiram snapped. Make sure the next batch of the powder is stronger. I want him in the ground before the heavy snows block the pass. Outside in the bitter cold, Ruth did not gasp. Her expression did not change. She quietly adjusted the massive logs in her arms. She carried them into the cookhouse. She dropped them loudly into the woodbox. She stood in the center of the kitchen. The heat from the iron stove washed over her frozen face. It mimics the rot perfectly. The next batch of the powder. She looked at the small, unmarked canvas sack sitting isolated on the prep table. The medicinal flower. She walked over to it. She untied the rough twine. She looked inside. It was stark white. Flawless. She had been boiling it twice a day. She had been the instrument of a man's agonizing, drawn-out execution. She did not panic. Panic was useless. Panic was for women who had something to lose. Ruth had already lost everything. She reached her thick, scarred hand into the sack. She pinched a small amount of the white powder between her thumb and forefinger. She carried it to the window into the sharp, pale afternoon light. She rubbed her fingers together. Flour is soft. It compresses. It turns to dust. This did not compress. It resisted. It scratched violently against the thick calluses of her skin. She held her fingers up to the light. The powder caught the sun. It sparkled. Tiny, microscopic prisms of light. Crushed glass. Ground down to a fine, lethal grit, mixed with trace amounts of poison. It was designed to slowly lacerate a man's internal organs with every bite he swallowed. It was the most agonizing, cruel death imaginable. Ruth stared at the sparkling grit on her fingertips. The sheriff in Oakhaven had watched her sister steal her life and did nothing. The law was corrupt. Men like Hiram ruled the world because they were ruthless, and because good people looked away. Ruth wiped the glass dust onto her apron. She was not going to look away. Not again. The iron triangle rang out. It was time to prepare the evening feed. Ruth turned back to the stove. She would cook for the men. She would follow the rules. But the rules of Ironwood Camp had just fundamentally changed. Act 2 was over. The silent war had begun. The camp slept. The only sound was the wind screaming through the timber derricks, a high, mechanical whine that sounded like tearing metal. Inside the cookhouse, Ruth did not sleep. She stood alone by the dying embers of the massive iron stove. The lantern was turned down low, casting long, bruised shadows across the log walls. She reached into her pocket. She pulled out the small canvas sack of Hiram's medicinal flower. She tied the rough twine into a brutal double knot. She pried up a loose, grease-stained floorboard beneath her cot and shoved the sack into the frozen dirt underneath. She let the floorboard fall back into place. The poison was hidden. Now she needed a cure. Years in a bakery had taught Ruth the chemistry of the earth. She knew what yeast did to sugar. She knew what heat did to fat, and she knew what the body needed when it was broken. She walked to the root cellar beneath the pantry. She bypassed the hard winter wheat and the salted pork. She found a crate of dried sweet potatoes. She found a heavy jar of pure, rendered sheep's tallow. She walked back to the woodpile. She took her sharpest boning knife and shaved the inner, pale bark off the seasoned willow logs. Willow bark was intensely bitter, but it was a natural analgesic. It killed pain. She took her own cast-iron pot, the heavy one she had carried from Oakhaven. She filled it with clean water from the pump. She dropped in the sweet potatoes, letting the water soften them into a thick, starchy base. Starch would coat a lacerated stomach lining. She added a heavy spoonful of the sheep's tallow to lubricate the digestive tract and stop the internal bleeding. Finally, she tossed in the shaved willow bark to numb the torn nerves. She set the iron pot directly over the white-hot coals. She watched the water bubble. It smelled of earth and fat. It smelled of survival. She let it reduce until it was a thick, heavy broth. She poured it into a clean tin bowl. It was past midnight. The temperature outside was well below freezing. Ruth wrapped her thin wool shawl tightly around her head and massive shoulders. She held the steaming bowl in her hands. She pushed open the cookhouse door and stepped out into the void. The wind hit her like a physical blow. It drove sharp ice crystals into her cheeks. She lowered her head and pushed forward. Her heavy boots broke through the frozen crust of the mud with a rhythmic crunch. She did not look at the main bunkhouse. She did not look at Hiram's window. She walked straight toward the dark, sagging silhouette of cabin 4. She reached the sawed-off pine stump. The bowl of gray paste she had left there hours ago was frozen solid, a block of deadly ice. Ruth stepped past the stump. She stood before the heavy wooden door. The iron latch was coated in a thick layer of frost. Hiram had promised to bury her in the mud if she crossed this threshold. He had promised to end her life if she breathed the air inside. Ruth raised her thick, calloused hand. She did not knock. She grabbed the frozen iron latch. The skin of her palm stuck briefly to the freezing metal. She ignored the sting. She pressed her heavy thumb down. The latch resisted, frozen shut by weeks of neglect. Ruth leaned her massive shoulder against the wood and shoved. The ice shattered. The rusted hinges shrieked into the freezing night. The door swung open. The smell hit her instantly. It was not the smell of disease. It was the smell of copper, dried blood, and severe, unmitigated cold. The cabin was entirely dark. There was no fire in the stone hearth. The wind rushed in behind her, rattling the loose shingles on the roof. Ruth stepped inside and pushed the heavy door shut with her heel. The wind was cut off. The silence was absolute. She let her eyes adjust to the darkness. In the corner of the room, on a small wooden cot, lay Gideon. He was a shell of a man. The blankets covering him were thin and rigid with dirt. He lay entirely still. He didn't turn his head when the door opened. He didn't gasp. He was too exhausted to be afraid. He was simply waiting for the dark to finally take him. Ruth walked toward the cot. Her heavy boots made the floorboards groan. She stood over him. Even in the gloom, she could see the severe hollows of his cheeks. His jaw was locked tight in a permanent grimace of pain. His lips were cracked and stained dark brown from the internal bleeding. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. They were the eyes of a man who had accepted his execution. Ruth did not speak. Words were useless to a man drowning in pain. She set the steaming tin bowl on a crate next to the bed. She pulled up a heavy wooden stool. It groaned under her weight. She sat down. She was directly in his line of sight. Gideon slowly shifted his gaze. His eyes, dull and glassy, found her face. He looked at her heavy jaw, her broad shoulders, her wind-chapped skin. He did not recognize her. He had never seen her before. He waited for her to speak. He waited for the pity or the disgust or the final blow. She offered none of it. Ruth picked up the wooden spoon. She scooped a small amount of the thick, warm broth. She leaned forward. She did not ask for permission. She simply pressed the edge of the wooden spoon against his cracked lips. Gideon flinched, a weak, pathetic tremor. He clamped his mouth shut. He had learned over the last month that food equaled tearing agony. Ruth did not pull the spoon away. She kept it pressed firmly, patiently against his mouth. "Open," she said. It was a command, low, flat. It was not a plea. It was the voice of a woman who had carried 50-pound sacks of grain. It was immovable. Gideon looked into her eyes. He saw no pity there. He saw only a terrifying, solid will. Slowly, painfully, he parted his lips. Gideon swallowed. The warm liquid slid down his ruined throat. He immediately tensed, his hands balled into fists, clutching the filthy woolen blanket. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. He waited for the agonizing, familiar tear of microscopic glass slicing into raw tissue. He waited for the metallic taste of his own blood to rise in the back of his throat. It did not come. Instead, a thick, heavy warmth settled in his gut. The sweet potato starch acted like a physical bandage, coating the weeping lacerations. The dense sheep's tallow coated the friction of his damaged tract. Slowly, the bitter, medicinal sting of the willow bark began to seep into his bloodstream. It worked like a cold iron pressed against a burn, dulling the sharp, screaming nerves in his abdomen. Gideon let out a breath. It was a long, shuddering sound. The tension drained from his jaw. He opened his eyes and stared at the heavy woman sitting in the dark. She did not smile. She did not offer a comforting platitude. She simply dipped the wooden spoon back into the iron pot, scraping the bottom to get the thickest part of the broth. She held the spoon up again. This time, Gideon did not hesitate. He leaned forward slightly, his neck trembling from the effort, and opened his mouth. She fed him slowly. Between each spoonful, the silence of the cabin was heavy. Gideon's breathing was erratic, driven by weeks of sheer panic and pain. His chest heaved unevenly. Ruth stopped feeding him. She sat back on the groaning wooden stool. She placed her large, broad hands on her knees. She looked directly into his eyes, maintaining an unbreakable gaze. Then she took a slow, deep, deliberate breath in through her nose. She held it for 2 seconds. She exhaled loudly through her mouth. Gideon stared at her. She did it again. In, hold, out. It was a physical command, an anchor. Gideon's erratic, panicked lungs instinctively sought the rhythm of the larger, stronger force in the room. He took a breath. It caught in his chest. Ruth did not break eye contact. She breathed again. Deep, steady, unmovable. Slowly, Gideon matched her. The erratic heaving of his chest smoothed out. The panic in his eyes receded, replaced by the heavy, pulling weight of exhaustion. The silent language was established. She was regulating his broken body with her own solid mass. She fed him the rest of the bowl. When the tin was scraped clean, Gideon lay back against the wooden frame of the cot. For the first time in a month, his features were entirely relaxed. The willow bark had severed the pain. Within minutes, he fell into a deep, silent sleep. It was not the unconsciousness of a dying man. It was the heavy, restorative sleep of a body finally given the tools to repair itself. Ruth stood up. She picked up the empty tin bowl. She looked at the man on the cot one last time, then quietly let herself out into the freezing wind. The secret routine began. By day, Ruth was the machine. She stoked the fires, butchered the salt pork, and fed the 50 starving loggers. She endured Hiram's cold, evaluating stares. She scrubbed the massive zinc plates until her knuckles bled. And twice a day, right on schedule, she boiled the stark white medicinal flour. She walked out to the pine stump in the bitter cold. She placed the tin bowl on the wood, but she didn't leave it there. She would wait 5 minutes. Then she would take the bowl, walk deep into the tree line where the snow was thickest, and bury the poisoned paste deep in the frozen earth. Hiram saw her making the trips. He saw the empty bowls returning to the cookhouse. He believed the dead man was still eating the glass. By night, Ruth became the savior. When the camp fell dead, she brewed her true medicine. She hauled fresh water, shaved the bitter willow bark, and mashed the root vegetables. She slipped through the freezing shadows to cabin 4. The physical toll on Ruth was devastating. She was sleeping less than 2 hours a night. The brutal, freezing walks to the cabin drained the heat from her core. Dark, heavy circles bruised the skin under her eyes. Her thick shoulders ached with a deep, permanent throb. But she did not stop. A heavy woman is built for endurance. On the 4th night, Gideon was awake when she opened the door. He was sitting up. He was weak, his arms shaking as they held his weight against the mattress, but he was upright. The gray pallor of death had left his skin. Ruth walked in and set the steaming pot on the crate. She pulled up the heavy wooden stool. Gideon didn't wait for her to lift the spoon. He reached out with a trembling, calloused hand. His fingers brushed against hers. His skin was rough, scarred from years of swinging a pickaxe, but it was warm. He took the wooden spoon from her. He looked at her hands. He saw the cracked skin, the split knuckles blackened with dried blood, the raw burns from the lye soap. He saw the immense, grueling labor she was undertaking just to keep him breathing. He looked up at her face. He didn't see a fat cook. He didn't see a discarded widow. He saw the only true gravity in Ironwood Camp. He dipped the spoon into the bowl and fed himself. By the end of the second week, the mountain was buried under 4 feet of dense, packed snow. The temperature stayed relentlessly below freezing. Ruth's heavy leather boots began to rot from the constant cycle of freezing mud and scalding kitchen grease. The seams split. She wrapped her feet in rough burlap potato sacks, binding them tight with hemp twine. She did not ask Hiram for new boots. She asked for nothing. She moved through the grueling days entirely on muscle memory. Chop, boil, knead, scrub. Her massive shoulders stooped slightly under the compounding weight of exhaustion. But every night she made the trek. On the 14th night, she pushed open the door to cabin 4. The rusted iron hinges did not shriek. They were completely silent. Ruth stopped in the doorway. She looked at the iron. The hinges were glistening with a thick layer of fresh grease. She looked into the room. Gideon was not on the cot. He was standing by the stone hearth. He held a piece of split pine in his hand. A small, carefully managed fire cracked in the grate. The cabin was warm. He had found the strength to clean the chimney, grease the door, and build a fire. He turned to look at her. He was still gaunt. His clothes hung loose on his frame, but he stood entirely straight. The terrifying, quiet strength had returned to his posture. Ruth stepped inside and shut the door. The silence between them was no longer the silence of a tomb. It was a barricade. She walked to the wooden crate. She carried the heavy iron pot of sweet potato and willow bark broth. She set it down. She was breathing heavily. The walk through the deep snow had drained her. She reached for the heavy wooden stool. Gideon moved. He was faster than he looked. He reached the stool first. He pulled it away from the crate and positioned it closer to the hearth, directly in the path of the radiating heat. He looked at Ruth. He looked at her burlap-wrapped feet, caked in frozen snow. He looked at her raw, bleeding knuckles. He pointed to the stool. It was a simple, practical gesture. Sit. Get warm. Ruth looked at him. She did not argue. She lowered her heavy frame onto the stool. The heat from the fire hit her frozen face. It was agonizing at first as the blood rushed back into her numb skin. She closed her eyes and let out a long, slow breath. When she opened her eyes, Gideon was holding the iron pot. He had fetched 2 clean tin spoons from his own supply box. He sat on the edge of the cot facing her. He handed her one of the spoons. He did not eat the broth alone. He waited for her. Ruth took the spoon. They ate in absolute silence. The only sound was the crackle of the pine sap in the fire and the scrape of tin. He was sharing his rations with the woman who had saved him. It was a communion of survivors. When the pot was empty, Gideon set it down. He looked at her hands. He reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, heavy tin. It was badger fat, used by miners to seal leather and heal severe skin cracks. He held the tin out to her. He didn't offer to rub it on her hands. He knew she was not a woman who needed to be coddled. He simply provided the tools she needed to endure. Ruth took the tin. She unscrewed the lid and rubbed the thick grease into her split knuckles. The sharp sting faded into a dull throb. "Thank you," she said. It was the first time she had spoken to him in 2 weeks. Her voice was low, rough as tree bark. Gideon nodded once. The next morning, the fragile piece shattered. Ruth was in the cookhouse, plunging the zinc plates into boiling lye water. The heavy door kicked open. Hiram stomped in, kicking a spray of dirty snow across the freshly scrubbed floorboards. He did not look at the stove. He walked directly to the prep table. He stared at the spot where the canvas sack of medicinal flour used to sit. He had noticed it missing. Ruth kept it hidden under the floorboards now, only taking it out to bury small amounts each day. Hiram turned his pale, rusted nail eyes on her. He's taking too long, Hiram rasped. The doctor said 3 weeks maximum. It's been almost 4. A man whose stomach is entirely rotted out cannot survive a month of winter. Not on thin paste. Ruth continued to scrub a tin plate. I leave the bowl on the stump. The bowl is empty when I return. Hiram stepped closer. His massive shadow fell over her heavy frame. Maybe you're feeding him something else. Maybe you're giving him company rations. If I find out you've been sneaking him salt pork or beans, I will whip you until your bones show. Ruth set the plate down. She turned to face him. Her hands were dripping with scalding, caustic lye water. I follow the rules, she said, entirely flat. Hiram stared at her broad, unblinking face. He couldn't read her. That enraged him more. I'm tired of waiting, Hiram growled. The snow is getting too deep for the marshal to ride up here anyway. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to cabin 4. I'm taking my revolver. If the rot hasn't finished him, I'll put a bullet in his head and claim it was mercy. He leaned in, his whiskey breath hot against her face. Don't bother boiling his paste tonight, widow. The dead don't need supper. Hiram turned and walked out, slamming the door. Ruth stood perfectly still. The lye water dripped from her fingertips, hissing as it hit the hot iron stove. The timeline was gone. The quiet survival was over. Hiram was going to walk into cabin 4 and kill Gideon in cold blood. Ruth wiped her hands on her stiff canvas apron. She looked out the grease-stained window at the heavy timber derricks. She was a woman who built her life around silent, enduring labor. But tomorrow, silence would not be enough. Ruth waited until the camp was entirely dead. Outside, the weather was shifting. The bitter, biting wind of the past 3 weeks was thickening into a low, guttural howl. The sky turned the color of bruised iron. A massive winter blizzard was rolling down from the high peaks. By dawn, Ironwood Camp would be completely cut off from the valley. Ruth walked to her cot in the dark. She knelt heavily on the freezing floorboards. She pried up the loose plank and reached into the freezing dirt. She pulled out the small canvas sack of Hiram's medicinal flour. She tied the rough twine securely to the thick canvas strings of her apron. She did not boil water tonight. Broth was a meal for the sick. Gideon was no longer sick. Instead, she walked to the pantry. She took her heavy cleaver and hacked off a massive, thick slab of salt-cured pork. She grabbed a full loaf of dense, heavy rye bread she had baked that morning. She wrapped them both in a clean flour sack. A man needed solid food to stand his ground. Finally, she walked to the massive iron stove. Her cast-iron skillet sat on the edge, still radiating a dull heat. She wrapped a thick rag around the handle and picked it up. She did not leave it behind. She opened the cookhouse door and stepped into the storm. The blizzard was already blinding. The snow drove sideways, sharp as needles against her exposed skin. The mud was gone, replaced by knee-deep drifts that fought her with every step. She lowered her head, letting her heavy shoulders break the wind. She kept her grip on the iron skillet absolute. She reached cabin 4. She didn't bother with the sawed-off stump. She pushed the heavy door open and forced it shut against the screaming wind. Gideon was sitting by the hearth. He had his heavy wool coat on. He was using a piece of sandstone to sharpen a hunting knife. He looked up. He saw the thick slab of pork. He saw the loaf of bread. He saw the massive cast-iron skillet hanging from her right hand. He stopped sharpening the blade. He stood up. Ruth walked to the heavy wooden table in the center of the room. She set the meat and bread down. Then she untied the canvas sack from her apron. She placed it next to the food. Hiram, Ruth said. Her voice was flat, cutting through the noise of the wind rattling the roof. Tomorrow morning at dawn. Gideon's jaw tightened. He tired of waiting? Yes, Ruth said. He is bringing his revolver. He told me not to bring your rations. He intends to shoot you and tell the camp the stomach rot finally killed you. She reached out and untied the knot on the canvas sack. She tipped it slightly, spilling a small mound of the stark white powder onto the rough pine table. It was never rot, Ruth said. Gideon looked at the powder. He stepped closer. The light from the hearth fire caught the mound of flour. It sparkled, tiny vicious prisms of light. He reached out a calloused finger and pressed it into the powder. When he pulled his hand back, a thin, bright line of crimson blood welled up on his fingertip. He stared at his own blood. The realization hit him, cold and heavy. "Glass," Gideon whispered. His voice was a terrifying low rumble. "Crushed window glass." "And arsenic," Ruth added. "A slow bleed. He wanted your gold claim. If he shot you a month ago, the federal marshal would have investigated. A sick man dying naturally meant the claim reverted to the camp." To him, Gideon looked from the sparkling poison to the heavy iron skillet in Ruth's hand. He finally understood the sheer magnitude of what this heavy, silent woman had done for him. She had not just fed him. She had stood between him and a calculated, agonizing execution, risking her own life every single night. He picked up a clean rag and wiped the blood from his thumb. His eyes, once hollow and defeated, were now completely black with cold, focused fury. He looked at Ruth. "The storm is going to bury this camp by sunrise. Nobody goes in. Nobody goes out. When Hiram walks through that door, he won't be alone. He'll bring his loyal men to drag my body out." He stepped closer to her. "If you are found in this cabin with me, he will kill you too. He will hang you from the timber derrick and claim you went mad. You need to go back to the cookhouse. Now." Ruth did not move. Her broad shoulders remained perfectly square. "I have nowhere to go," Ruth said. "My husband is dead. My sister sold me for $1. I am entirely out of places to run, and I am tired of walking." She set her cast iron skillet down on the table, right next to the poisoned flour. The heavy metal made a dull, final thud against the wood. "I follow the rules," Ruth said, looking Gideon dead in the eyes. "The water must boil, the plates must be clean, and the man who poisons the flour must be held to account." Gideon stared at her. A profound, silent respect locked between them. He didn't tell her to leave again. He reached out and placed his hand flat on the table, inches from hers. An unspoken vow. They sat down by the fire. Outside, the blizzard screamed, sealing the camp in a wall of white. They did not sleep. They ate the salted pork. They ate the heavy rye bread. They fueled their bodies, and they waited for the dawn. Dawn did not arrive. The sky simply shifted from pitch black to a bruised, suffocating gray. The blizzard had swallowed Ironwood Camp entirely. The towering timber derricks were invisible, lost in a swirling, howling whiteout. The snow was already waist-deep and climbing. The wind did not blow, it screamed. It tore shingles off the bunkhouse roof and drove ice crystals hard enough to draw blood. The mountain was locked. No supply wagons would come up. No federal marshal would ride down. The camp was a closed, frozen box. Inside his office in the main bunkhouse, Hiram stood by his iron stove. He was not cold. He poured 2 fingers of cheap rye whiskey into a glass and drank it in one swallow. It burned a warm, satisfying path down his throat. Today was the day. He walked to his heavy oak desk. He opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a Colt .45 revolver. It was a heavy, brutal piece of machinery. He cracked the loading gate. He spun the cylinder, checking the brass cartridges. The oiled steel clicked with a sharp, mathematical precision. 6 rounds. He only needed 1. Hiram felt a deep, vicious satisfaction. The storm was a gift. It provided the ultimate cover. A man dying of severe stomach rot would naturally succumb to the freezing temperatures of a blizzard. It was a clean narrative. He would have Gideon's corpse dragged out, wrapped in a canvas tarp, and buried in the snowbank until the spring thaw. By then, the gold claim would be legally his. He shoved the heavy revolver into the deep pocket of his sheepskin coat. He grabbed his thick leather gloves. He stepped out of his office and into the main bunkhouse. The room smelled of unwashed men and damp wool. The 50 loggers were awake, shivering in their bunks, waiting for the iron triangle to ring for breakfast. Hiram bypassed the main crew, He walked to a corner bunk and kicked the wooden frame hard. Two men sat up, Carver and Stokes. They were Hiram's enforcers, men built like brick walls with missing teeth and a shared history of violence down in the valley. They did not chop wood. They broke jaws when the camp loggers complained about their wages. "Get up!" Hiram barked over the howling wind outside. "Get your coats. Grab a heavy canvas tarp and some rope from the supply shed." Stokes wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "What for, boss? Ain't nobody working in this." "We aren't working," Hiram said, his pale eyes entirely dead. "We're cleaning house. The rot finally took the man in cabin 4. We're going to drag the body out before the smell sets into the timber." Carver and Stokes exchanged a look, then nodded. They knew better than to ask questions. They pulled on their heavy coats. The three men stepped out into the blizzard. The wind instantly robbed them of their breath. The cold was a physical weight pressing against their chests. They waded through the waist-deep drifts, their boots crunching loudly in the freezing air. Hiram did not lead them straight to cabin 4. He led them to the cookhouse first. He expected the massive iron stove to be roaring. He expected the smell of boiling coffee and frying salt pork. He expected the heavy, silent widow to be moving methodically between the prep tables, entirely subjugated by his commands. He reached the cookhouse door and kicked it open. The wind rushed inside, blowing a swirl of white snow across the floorboards. Hiram stopped in the doorway. Carver and Stokes bumped into him from behind. The cookhouse was freezing. The massive iron stove was dead. Its iron belly was entirely black and cold. The zinc washing basins were empty. The 50 tin plates sat unwashed in a towering, greasy stack on the prep table. There was no coffee. There was no fire. And there was no cook. Hiram's jaw tightened. He stepped inside, his boots tracking snow across the floor. He looked at the pantry. The door hung open. He looked at the small cot wedged in the corner. The thin woolen blanket was neatly folded. "Where is the fat cow?" Stokes muttered, his teeth chattering from the cold. Hiram did not answer. He walked to the center of the room. He looked at the prep table. The heavy, seasoned cast-iron skillet that the widow carried everywhere was gone. A cold fury began to rise in Hiram's chest. It was not panic. It was pure, unadulterated rage. She had defied him. She had stopped working. She had taken her skillet and walked out into the storm. A heavy woman with no coat wouldn't make it a mile in this blizzard. She had essentially committed suicide. But Hiram's instincts, honed by years of back-alley survival, prickled at the back of his neck. She didn't just wander off into the snow to die. She was a machine. Machines didn't quit. They broke, or they were redirected. He looked out the grease-stained window. He couldn't see cabin 4 through the whiteout, but he knew exactly where it was. "Forget the tarp!" Hiram snapped. He pulled his thick leather gloves tighter. He reached into his pocket and curled his fingers around the cold, checkered wooden grip of his revolver. "Draw your knives," Hiram commanded. "We're going to cabin 4. They stepped back out into the screaming wind. Hiram led the way, plowing through the heavy snowdrifts. His eyes narrowed against the biting ice. He was going to put a bullet in Gideon's skull. And if the heavy widow was somehow in that room with him, he was going to make sure she never walked out. The wind tore at Hiram's face like rusted wire. The snowdrifts were chest-high near the tree line. Carver and Stokes struggled behind him, their curses swallowed by the howling blizzard. They reached the sawed-off pine stump. It was entirely buried under a mound of white. Hiram stared at the heavy wooden door of cabin 4. There was no smoke rising from the chimney, the wind snatching it away before it could form. He expected to find a frozen tomb. He didn't bother with the latch. He raised his heavy leather boot and kicked the door right at the center seam. The wood splintered. The door violently swung inward, slamming against the log wall. The blizzard rushed into the room, swirling white snow across the floorboards. Hiram stepped through the threshold, his hand tight on the revolver in his pocket. Carver and Stokes crowded in behind him, drawing their long, jagged hunting knives. Hiram stopped. He did not find a frozen corpse. He did not find a dying man gasping for his last breath. The cabin was aggressively warm. A thick, steady fire roared in the stone hearth, pushing back against the bitter cold. In the center of the room, standing perfectly straight behind the heavy pine table, was Gideon. He wore his heavy wool coat. His jaw was set like a steel trap. He looked hollowed out by the past month of starvation, but the gray pallor of death was completely gone. The muscles in his neck were thick and corded. He was not a dead man. He was a coiled spring. And standing next to him, immovable as a mountain, was Ruth. She wore her stained canvas apron. Her broad shoulders were square. Her thick hands rested flat on the table. Beside her right hand sat the massive black cast-iron skillet. Beside her left hand sat the spilled mound of sparkling white flour. Hiram stared at them. The shock registered in his pale eyes for only a fraction of a second before it hardened into pure, acidic hatred. He pulled the Colt .45 from his coat pocket. He let the hammer click back. The sharp mechanical sound cut through the roar of the wind outside. "Well," Hiram rasped, his voice dripping with venom. "I see the fat cow found her way to the slaughterhouse." Ruth did not blink. She did not shrink away from the heavy barrel of the gun. Hiram stepped fully into the room, letting Stokes push the door shut against the storm. The three men spread out, trapping Ruth and Gideon against the hearth. "You stupid heavy animal," Hiram spat, pointing the gun directly at Ruth's chest. "You think you're clever? You think boiling a few roots makes you a savior? Your own sister couldn't stand the sight of you. Your husband worked himself into an early grave just to pay for the food you shoved down your throat. You are nothing but displaced garbage, widow, and you just dragged yourself into a grave you can't climb out of." Ruth absorbed the insults. They were just words. Words did not lacerate a stomach lining. Words did not carry the weight of iron. She looked at the gun. Then she looked at Hiram's eyes. "The flour was poisoned," Ruth said. Her voice was an absolute flatline. "Crushed glass and arsenic." Hiram let out a harsh, barking laugh. "And who are you going to tell, widow? The snow is 10 feet deep in the pass. The camp is mine. You're just a rogue cook who went mad and tried to feed my men ground glass. It's a tragedy. I had to put you down to save the camp, and poor Gideon here, well, his heart just gave out from the shock." He nodded to Carver and Stokes. "Take the woman. Gut her. Leave the miner to me." Stokes stepped forward. He was a massive man, fueled by cruelty and cheap liquor. He lunged toward the table, his jagged knife raised to slash at Ruth's heavy canvas apron. He never reached her. Gideon moved. It was not the slow, agonizing shuffle of a sick man. It was the explosive, terrifying speed of a miner who swung steel pickaxes into solid granite for 10 hours a day. He stepped around the table in a blur of heavy wool. He caught Stokes' knife hand midair. The impact sounded like two logs slamming together. Gideon's large calloused hand wrapped entirely around Stokes' thick wrist. Stokes' eyes went wide with sudden, uncomprehending shock. This was supposed to be a dead man. Gideon didn't flinch. He twisted his grip. Brutally. A loud, wet snap echoed through the warm cabin. Stokes screamed, dropping the hunting knife as his wrist bone fractured under the crushing pressure. Before Stokes could pull away, Gideon drove his heavy leather boot directly into the side of the thug's knee. The joint buckled backward with a sickening crunch. Stokes collapsed to the floorboards, howling in agony, clutching his ruined leg. Carver froze. The knife trembled in his hand. He looked at Stokes writhing on the floor, then looked up at Gideon's dead, black eyes. Carver took a slow, terrified step backward toward the door. Hiram's face drained of color. He leveled the Colt .45 directly at Gideon's chest. His finger tightened on the trigger. "Take one more step, miner," Hiram snarled, a slight tremor finally entering his voice. "And I'll blow a hole right through your lungs." Gideon stood over the broken body of Stokes. He did not raise his hands. He did not cower. He looked at the black hole of the gun barrel, then he looked at the foreman who had spent a month feeding him crushed glass. The silence in the cabin was heavier than the storm outside. Gideon didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The raw authority in his tone vibrated in the floorboards. He simply said, "She stays. You leave." Hiram's finger trembled on the trigger of the Colt .45. He stared at Gideon. He looked for the weakness. He looked for the stagger of a dying man pushing himself too far. He found nothing. Gideon stood rooted to the floorboards like an old-growth pine. The sheer, immovable mass of him was terrifying. Behind Hiram, Carver made his choice. Carver was a thug, not a soldier. He broke jaws for silver coins. He did not die in freezing cabins for a foreman's gold claim. Carver dropped his hunting knife. It clattered uselessly against the floorboards. He took 3 rapid steps backward, hit the doorframe, and bolted out into the screaming whiteout of the blizzard. He didn't look back. Stokes was still on the floor, weeping in high, breathless gasps as he clutched his shattered knee. Hiram was entirely alone. He realized it in a fraction of a second. His authority was gone. His enforcers were broken or fled. The quiet, sick man he had been poisoning for a month had just dismantled his muscle in 2 seconds. Desperation is a dangerous, unpredictable thing. Hiram's pale eyes darted wildly. He couldn't shoot Gideon before the miner closed the distance and snapped his neck. He knew that now. The physical disparity was too great. So Hiram shifted his aim. He swung the heavy barrel of the revolver away from Gideon's chest and pointed it directly at Ruth's broad stomach. "Back off!" Hiram screamed, a shrill cracking sound that tore his throat. "Back off, miner, or I blow her in half!" Gideon froze. The muscles in his massive shoulders locked tight. He stopped his advance. He would risk his own life without a second thought, but he would not risk hers. Hiram saw the hesitation. A twisted, wet smile cracked his chapped lips. He had found the leverage. "That's right," Hiram breathed, his chest heaving. "You care about the fat cow. The town threw her away, but you think she's your salvation. You're both pathetic." He pulled the hammer back further. "Now step away from the table, both of you." Gideon didn't move. He looked at Ruth. Ruth looked back at him. Her face was entirely blank. No panic, no pleading. She did not beg for her life. She was a woman who had carried the crushing weight of a dead husband's debt, a sister's betrayal, and 50-pound flour sacks. She was not afraid of a bullet. She was only afraid of failing to finish the job. Ruth looked down at her right hand. The thick rag was wrapped tightly around the handle of her cast-iron skillet. 10 pounds of seasoned black iron. Hiram was focusing entirely on Gideon. He expected the woman to cower. He expected her to freeze in terror. He forgot that a heavy woman possesses momentum. Ruth did not scream. She did not lunge. She pivoted on her heavy leather boots, using the massive, dense core of her torso to generate torque. She gripped the iron handle with both of her scarred hands. She swung the 10-pound skillet in a low, brutal, sweeping arc across the table. She wasn't aiming for Hiram's head. She was aiming for the gun. The heavy iron bypassed the mound of poisoned flour and smashed directly into Hiram's right wrist. The impact was sickening. It sounded like an axe biting into a wet log. Hiram's wrist bones shattered instantly under the blunt force trauma. The Colt .45 discharged. The deafening roar of the gunshot shook the dust from the rafters. The bullet missed Ruth by inches, burying itself deep into the log wall behind the stove, spraying a shower of pine splinters. The heavy revolver flew from Hiram's pulverized grip and clattered into the far corner of the room. Hiram let out a high-pitched, agonizing shriek. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his mangled arm. The shock of the pain was absolute. He couldn't breathe. He could only stare at his ruined wrist, his mind completely unable to process how the slow, heavy cook had just broken him. Ruth stood over the table. Her chest rose and fell in slow, rhythmic breaths. Her thick arms absorbed the shock of the swing. She slowly set the skillet back down on the wood. It made a dull, heavy thud. She had done her part. Gideon did not waste a second. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides. He did not punch Hiram. He did not kick him. He reached down with his calloused hands and grabbed the thick sheepskin collar of Hiram's coat. He hoisted the foreman off his knees with terrifying ease. Hiram's boots barely scraped the floorboards. Gideon dragged Hiram to the pine table. He slammed the foreman's chest against the edge of the wood, knocking the remaining air from his lungs. With one hand holding the back of Hiram's neck, Gideon forced the foreman's face down, inches from the surface of the table, inches from the small, sparkling mound of stark white powder. "Look at it!" Gideon's voice was a low, seismic rumble. Hiram squeezed his eyes shut, turning his head away, weeping from the pain in his wrist. Gideon's grip tightened on his neck, an immovable iron vice. He forced Hiram's face back toward the powder. "Open your eyes and look at it," Gideon commanded. Hiram opened his eyes. He stared at the crushed glass. He stared at the poison he had meticulously measured out for the last month. The smell of burnt gunpowder filled the small cabin, mixing with the sweet scent of the burning pine sap. The blizzard howled against the door. "You thought you were a god in this camp," Gideon said, his mouth right next to Hiram's ear. "You thought you could feed a man window panes and hide behind the winter. But you didn't see her." Gideon looked at Ruth. She stood beside them, solid, silent, and unbroken. "She saw everything," Gideon said. "And now you have nothing." Gideon pulled Hiram away from the table. He did not treat him with care. He threw the foreman onto the rough floorboards next to Stokes. Stokes was still whimpering in high, breathless gasps, his hands desperately clutching his ruined knee. Hiram curled into a tight, trembling ball, holding his shattered right wrist against his chest. The color had entirely drained from his face. Ruth walked over to the open doorway. The blizzard was howling, blowing thick layers of snow directly into the cabin. Stokes had dropped a heavy coil of hemp rope when he first fell. She picked it up. She didn't ask Gideon to do it. She was accustomed to finishing her own chores. She walked over to Hiram. "Put your hands behind your back," she said. Her voice was as cold as the wind outside. Hiram looked up at her. He saw the massive iron skillet sitting on the table. He saw Gideon standing over him, an immovable shadow. Hiram slowly, agonizingly moved his left arm behind his back, followed by his mangled right wrist. Ruth tied him. She used the same methodical, ruthless efficiency she used to tie up a heavy pork roast. She pulled the rough hemp tight, knotting it securely. She did not care if the coarse rope dug deeply into his broken bones. Hiram gasped in pain, tears of pure agony leaking from his pale eyes, but he did not fight. He was completely broken. She moved to Stokes next. She bound his hands tightly, then used a heavy strip of canvas torn from a flour sack to bind his shattered knee, pulling it tight enough to restrict the swelling and internal bleeding. She did not do it out of mercy. She did it out of practicality. A dead man could not be tried by a federal judge. Hiram leaned his head back against the frozen log wall. The brutal reality of his situation was finally settling in. He was locked in an isolated cabin, severely crippled, trapped with a man he had systematically tortured and a woman he had pushed to the absolute brink. "The camp won't stand for this," Hiram hissed, his voice weak and shaking. "When the storm breaks, 50 men will come looking for me. They'll see what you did. They'll burn this cabin to the ground." Gideon walked over to the stone hearth. He picked up a heavy, split pine log and dropped it onto the fire. A cloud of orange sparks shot up the dark chimney. "The men work for company wages," Gideon said, turning his broad back to the flames. "They don't work for you. When they see the glass in that sack, they won't burn this cabin. They'll build the gallows themselves." Hiram swallowed hard. The sound was audible in the quiet room. He knew Gideon was right. Loggers were hard, violent men, but they operated on a strict, unwritten code. They despised poison. Poison was a coward's weapon. If they discovered he had been feeding ground glass to a fellow worker to steal a gold claim, they would tear him apart before the valley authorities ever arrived. "I have money," Hiram breathed, sheer desperation leaking into his tone. "There is a company lockbox in my office. $2,000 in silver coin. I'll give you the combination. Both of you. Take it. Take the heavy draft horses when the snow clears. Just let me walk away." Gideon did not answer. He didn't even look at the foreman. He looked at Ruth. Ruth was back at the pine table. She was using her boning knife to slice the thick slab of salt-cured pork she had brought from the cookhouse. She ignored Hiram completely. She cut 2 thick, heavy pieces. She handed one to Gideon. "We eat," Ruth said flatly. "Then we wait." Hiram realized his words meant absolutely nothing. He was trying to bargain with a mountain. He slumped against the wall, squeezed his eyes shut, and surrendered to the blinding pain in his wrist. The long night began. Outside, the blizzard reached its terrifying peak. The wind sounded like a chorus of screaming machinery, tearing at the roof shingles, burying the entire camp under insurmountable drifts of white. The temperature plummeted further, icing over the inside of the cabin's single window. Inside, the fire burned steady. Ruth sat on her heavy wooden stool. Gideon sat on the edge of his cot. They did not speak. They did not need to. The silence between them was no longer the terrifying void of isolation. It was the quiet, shared endurance of 2 people holding the line. Gideon's body was exhausted. The explosive burst of adrenaline had drained his recovering muscles. His chest rose and fell in slow, heavy rhythms, but he kept his eyes open. He watched the heavy wooden door. He watched the 2 men bound on the floor. Ruth watched the fire. She rubbed the heavy badger fat into her knuckles again. The pain was still there, a sharp ache radiating up her thick forearms from the brutal impact of the iron skillet. She welcomed it. The pain meant she was alive. The pain meant her muscles had not failed when it mattered most. Hours bled into one another. Stokes passed out from the severe shock of his shattered knee. Hiram remained awake, shivering uncontrollably, trapped in his own nightmare. Slowly, the pitch-black darkness beyond the frosted window began to thin. The guttural howl of the wind dropped to a low, hollow moan. The rattling of the roof shingles stopped. The brutal, suffocating grip of the blizzard was finally breaking. Dawn had arrived. Ruth stood up from the heavy stool. She walked to the window and used the edge of her canvas apron to wipe away the thick layer of frost on the inside of the glass. The sky was a pale, blinding white. The storm had passed. Ironwood Camp was entirely buried under 10 feet of snow, transforming the ugly, scarred mud into a pristine, frozen ocean. She turned back to the room. Gideon was standing. He looked at the window. He looked at Hiram, who was slumped on the floor, pale and defeated. "It's over," Gideon said softly. Ruth walked to the heavy pine table. She picked up the small canvas sack of crushed glass. She tied it back onto her apron strings. She picked up her heavy cast-iron skillet. "No," Ruth said, her voice carrying the absolute immovable weight of the truth. "Now we show them." The sun broke over the jagged eastern ridge of the mountain like a shattered plate. The light it cast across Ironwood Camp was blinding, reflecting off 10 feet of unbroken, pristine snow. The silence was absolute. The mechanical whine of the timber derricks was gone. The rhythmic thud of axes was gone. The mountain was holding its breath. Inside the main bunkhouse, 50 loggers woke to freezing temperatures. The stoves had burned out in the night. The cookhouse triangle had not rung. When they pushed against the heavy wooden doors, they found them blocked by massive snowdrifts. They had to use their broadaxes to chop through the roof hatches, climbing out into the blinding white morning and using shovels to dig down to the main yard. Confusion spread quickly. The camp was paralyzed. Carver had vanished into the storm the night before. Hiram, the untouchable foreman, was missing. Stokes was missing, and the cookhouse was completely dead. No smoke rose from the chimney. No smell of salt pork cut the frigid air. The men gathered in the cleared space near the cookhouse, shivering in their heavy wool coats, their breath pluming in thick white clouds. The camp doctor, who had been trapped by the blizzard and slept in Hiram's office, stepped out onto the porch. He clutched his medical bag, his eyes bloodshot from cheap gin, looking nervously at the confused mob. "Where is the foreman?" a logger shouted, his beard caked in ice. "Where is the feed?" The doctor opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. He was looking past the loggers. He was looking toward the tree line. The men turned. Through the massive, waist-deep drifts of snow, 4 figures were moving slowly toward the center of the camp. Gideon led the way. He was breaking the trail. The snow was up to his thighs, but he pushed forward with the slow, terrifying, mechanical momentum of a steam engine. He did not look like a man who had spent the last month rotting from the inside out. He wore no hat. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat. His jaw was locked. He was the ghost of Cabin 4, fully materialized and vibrating with cold rage. Behind him, tied together by a thick length of coarse hemp rope, stumbled Hiram and Stokes. They were a pathetic sight. Stokes was using a thick pine branch as a crude crutch, his ruined knee dragging uselessly in the deep snow, weeping openly with every agonizing step. Hiram walked with his head bowed. His right wrist, mangled and swollen to twice its normal size, was bound tightly to his chest. The heavy sheepskin coat could not hide the violent, uncontrollable shivering of his broken body. And bringing up the rear was Ruth. She walked in the deep trench Gideon cut through the snow. Her heavy canvas apron was stiff with frost. Her broad shoulders were entirely square. In her right hand, she carried the black, seasoned cast-iron skillet. Tied to her apron strings was the small canvas sack. She did not look exhausted, she looked inevitable. The 50 loggers watched in stunned, absolute silence. No man raised an axe. No man stepped forward to help the foreman. They simply parted, creating a wide, silent corridor in the trampled snow. Gideon reached the center of the yard. He stopped right in front of the massive, scarred wooden chopping block used for splitting firewood. He turned around. He grabbed the hemp rope and hauled Hiram and Stokes forward, tossing them to the frozen ground. Stokes collapsed with a scream of agony. Hiram hit the snow hard, gasping for air, unable to break his fall with his ruined arm. Gideon looked at the 50 men. He looked at the terrified doctor standing on the porch. "The storm is over," Gideon said. His voice carried effortlessly in the crisp, freezing air. It was a heavy, resonant sound. "The work stops." The loggers stared at him. A man from the back row finally found his voice. "Gideon, we thought you were dead. Hiram said the stomach rot took you weeks ago." "It wasn't rot," Gideon said flatly. He stepped back, giving the floor to Ruth. Ruth walked forward. Her heavy boots crunched loudly in the snow. She did not look at the men. She did not seek their approval. She walked directly to the massive wooden chopping block. She untied the small canvas sack from her apron. She placed it squarely in the center of the scarred wood. She turned to face the crowd. Her face was a mask of cold, enduring stone. She pointed a thick, calloused finger at the trembling doctor on the porch. "He called it stomach rot," Ruth said, her voice deep and unwavering. "He told the foreman to isolate the man. He brought a sack of medicinal flour. He told me to boil it into paste, twice a day, to ease the pain." The doctor's face drained of all color. He took a step backward, his hand grasping the wooden railing of the porch. I am a medical professional. The man was contagious. I followed standard procedure." Ruth did not argue. Arguing was a waste of breath. She raised the heavy 10-pound cast-iron skillet. She brought it down onto the canvas sack with a violent, crushing blow. The impact echoed across the frozen mountain, but it was the sound that followed that made the blood run cold in the veins of 50 hardened loggers. It was a high-pitched, screeching crunch. The terrible, unnatural sound of iron grinding against microscopic shards of glass. Ruth pressed her heavy weight onto the skillet and ground it in a slow circle. Screech! Crunch. The men visibly recoiled. Ruth lifted the skillet. She reached out and untied the mouth of the canvas sack, peeling the fabric back. She stepped aside. "Look," she commanded. The loggers hesitated, then slowly shuffled forward. They crowded around the chopping block. The morning sun was bright, cutting directly through the crisp air and hitting the stark white powder spilled on the wood. It sparkled. Thousands of tiny, lethal prisms of light reflecting the sun. "Glass," one of the older loggers whispered, the horror dawning in his eyes. "Crushed window glass." "Mixed with arsenic," Gideon's voice rumbled from behind them. "A slow bleed. Designed to tear the stomach lining to shreds over a month. Designed to look exactly like the rot. He wanted my gold claim up the ridge. If he shot me, the marshal would ask questions. If I died of disease, the claim reverted to him." The loggers slowly turned their heads. They looked at Hiram, who was kneeling in the snow, his face buried in his good hand, sobbing silently. Then they looked at the doctor. The doctor dropped his medical bag. The cheap gin bottles inside shattered. He turned and tried to run toward the tree line. He didn't make it 5 steps. 3 massive loggers stepped into his path, their faces twisted in absolute disgust. They grabbed him by his dirty wool suit and threw him violently back into the snow next to Hiram. Poison was the ultimate sin on the mountain. It was an invisible, cowardly death. And to force a woman to unknowingly feed it to a dying man was an offense that stripped a foreman of any remaining authority. The mob did not roar. They did not riot. They simply formed a tight, silent circle around Hiram, Stokes, and the doctor. It was a cold, calculated reckoning. Gideon stood next to Ruth. They had brought the truth into the light. The execution of justice now belonged to the camp. The loggers did not use their axes. They did not need to. The sheer, overwhelming force of 50 betrayed men was enough. An older logger, a man named Miller who had worked the mountain for 20 years, stepped out from the circle. He looked at the crushed glass sparkling on the chopping block, then looked down at Hiram. "We work for lumber wages," Miller said, his voice rough with disgust. "We bleed for this camp, but we don't work for a murderer." Miller gestured to 4 of the largest men in the crew. "Take them to the root cellar beneath the meat locker. Throw them in. Nail the heavy door shut from the outside. They can eat the raw potatoes and drink the frost melt until the pass clears. When the federal marshal finally rides up, we hand them over." Hiram's head snapped up. Panic finally shattered his stoic, arrogant facade. "You can't put me in there. It's freezing. My wrist is shattered. I need a doctor." He looked wildly at the camp doctor, who was already being hauled to his feet by his collar. "You have a doctor," Miller said flatly. "You can share the dark with him." The loggers moved with brutal, mechanical efficiency. They dragged Hiram, Stokes, and the weeping doctor across the frozen yard. The heavy wooden door of the root cellar was hauled open, revealing a pitch-black, freezing square carved directly into the permafrost. They tossed the 3 men inside. The heavy door slammed shut. The sound of 6-inch iron nails being driven into the wood frame echoed sharply across the camp. It was over. The mob slowly dispersed. The oppressive, terrifying weight that had hung over Ironwood Camp for months vanished, replaced by the crisp, blinding reality of the winter sun. The men needed a foreman. They looked toward Gideon, standing tall and immovable in the snow. But Gideon shook his head. He was not a company man. He was a miner, and he had a gold claim to work. He looked at Ruth. She was still standing by the chopping block, holding her cast-iron skillet. He didn't offer a dramatic speech. He simply nodded to her, turned, and began the slow walk back to cabin 4 to rest, to heal, and to rebuild his life. Ruth watched him go. Then she turned and walked back to the cookhouse. The routine resumed, but the world had shifted. Ruth still woke at 3 in the morning. She still hauled the heavy sacks of flour. She still kneaded the dough until her massive shoulders burned. But the fear was gone. The 50 loggers no longer treated her like a draft horse. When she walked through the mess hall to serve the boiling coffee, the men stopped talking. They cleared a wide path. They took off their woolen hats. They did not look at her heavy waistline. They did not look at her scarred, plain face. They looked at her thick, calloused hands, and they bowed their heads in absolute, silent reverence. She was the woman who had stood down a loaded gun with a frying pan. She was the gravity that held the camp together. 6 weeks later, the spring thaw finally hit the mountain. The 10 feet of pristine snow collapsed into roaring streams of ice water and deep, treacherous mud. The pass opened. The federal marshal arrived with a heavily armed escort and a prison wagon. Miller and the loggers pried the iron nails from the root cellar door. Hiram, Stokes, and the doctor were dragged out into the blinding spring sunlight. They were filthy, half-starved, and completely broken. Hiram's arm had healed wrong in the dark, twisted and useless. The marshal looked at the sparkling canvas sack of crushed glass. He took 50 sworn statements from the men. He chained the 3 men to the iron rings in the back of the prison wagon. As the wagon rolled out of the camp, heading down toward the valley and the gallows, Hiram looked back toward the cookhouse. Ruth stood on the porch. She did not smile, she did not wave. She simply watched him go, her face an unreadable mask of stone. The debt was paid. That evening, the camp was quiet. The loggers were celebrating the spring thaw in the bunkhouse. Ruth stood alone in the cookhouse pantry. She opened her canvas satchel. She folded her single, heavy woolen dress. She placed her tin comb inside. She had been sent here by her cruel sister as an exile. She had been contracted by a foreman who was now in chains. The crisis was over. Gideon was healed. The camp was safe. In Ruth's pragmatic, realistic mind, a woman like her, heavy, silent, and discarded, did not get a happy ending. She only got the work, and the work here was done. She tied her canvas apron around her waist. She walked into the main kitchen. She picked up the heavy, seasoned cast iron skillet. She wiped a single drop of grease from its rim. The door to the cookhouse opened. Ruth turned. Gideon stood in the doorway. He was fully restored. The hollows in his cheeks were gone, filled out by solid muscle and Ruth's heavy salt pork. His dark eyes were clear, sharp, and entirely focused on her. He looked at the canvas satchel sitting on the pantry floor. He looked at the heavy woolen shawl draped over her arm. He stepped into the kitchen and closed the door behind him. The spring breeze was cut off. The room was warm, smelling of fresh yeast and wood smoke. He walked slowly across the floorboards until he stood directly in front of her. He was a massive man, but he did not tower over her. He stood exactly at her level. "The marshal finalized my papers today," Gideon said. His voice was a low, steady rumble. "The gold claim is legally mine. I'm tearing down cabin 4 tomorrow, building a real house up on the ridge. Solid pine, facing the east so it catches the morning sun." Ruth looked at him. She clutched the handle of her skillet tightly. "That is good. You earned it." She stepped to the side, preparing to walk past him, preparing to leave. Gideon didn't let her. He reached out. His large, calloused hand gently but firmly wrapped around the thick iron handle of her skillet, directly over her scarred knuckles. He stopped her momentum entirely. "The stove in the new house is going to be massive," Gideon said softly. He didn't look at the pan. He looked directly into her eyes. "It's going to draw too much air. It needs heavy iron to keep the heat steady. And I need the woman who knows how to use it." Ruth stared at him. For the first time in years, the stoic, immovable wall inside her chest trembled. She had been mocked by her sister, betrayed by her town, tossed into the freezing void to die. She had believed she was nothing but invisible labor. But Gideon saw her. He had seen her in the pitch-black cabin. He had seen her staring down the barrel of a Colt .45. He saw the beautiful, terrifying strength of her survival. Gideon slowly slid the cast-iron skillet from her grip. He turned. He walked over to the massive central support beam of the cookhouse. High up on the wood was a heavy, hand-forged iron hook. The hook meant for the master of the house. Gideon lifted the heavy pan and hung it securely on the hook. It made a solid ringing sound. Permanent. Immovable. He turned back to Ruth. He didn't drop to one knee. He didn't offer a flowery, dramatic vow. Men and women of the mountain did not survive on poetry. They survived on action. He walked back to her. He reached out and took her cracked, calloused hands in his. His grip was warm, rough, and entirely safe. They didn't need the town's permission to exist. The lamp burned between them, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.